Thanks for listening to Other People's Flowers. If you'd like to have your work featured on the program, please send it to editor@otherpeoplesflowers.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Old Ghosts by Hugo Gibson. Everybody gets divorced. This is the sage advice my grandfather gave me one weekend not long before he died. This was long before I knew anything about his criminal activities. Or really, anything about him as a man. I didn't know what he meant by it. I assumed it was just one of his senile comments, which he'd been making more and more before he died. Not long after he died, I was contacted by his executor and handed his personal diaries, but the contents of those are for later. First, I'll try to say something about my grandparents. It's important to understand that my grandmother always played second fiddle to my grandfather. At all family events, my grandfather would do the talking. At their Diamond Jubilee, my grandmother sat in the corner and said nothing. My grandmother's 70th, the same. 80th, the same. Even in their old wedding photos, always the same. Always my grandmother in silence and my grandfather regaling the guests with whatever story he wanted to share. He was the life and soul of every social event, public event and social engagement he went to. Everyone wants a well-spoken academic at their soiree, lightening the mood with his intellectual playfulness, the way forgotten academics only can. That's not to say that my grandmother was unhappy, more that she just came from a generation of women who were born playing second fiddle to men. She told me as much herself, in one of the rare moments she spoke her mind. My grandfather had lived a fairly typical academic life. The same life the legion of academics who never get the fame they hope for live. He taught in a small university town in the US, in a not insignificant university. After just 5 years of teaching, he decided it wasn't for him. So he took a payout, downsized house, spent the next 30 years doing pure research. Maybe that's what he meant by everyone gets divorced. He meant metaphorically divorced. And the advice he wanted to dispense to me was that at some point in life, you have to make sacrifices. But as it turned out, that's not what he meant at all. After retiring aged 65, my grandparents moved back to the UK after a 40-year absence. They spent a year in the annex of my grandfather's sister's large country home, and then bought a little house by the sea in Cornwall, with a view to make your heart scream for all the overlooked beauty in the world. My main memories of trips there and of family gatherings is of the family just sitting there, getting drunk and staring out the window at the sea. It used to annoy me that they just sat and did nothing except drink, but then I realised there are worse ways to spend your twilight years. My grandmother drunk herself into an alcohol-induced dementia, and then into death. 3 years later my grandfather was dead as well, having spent those 3 years telling us all he expected to die any minute. He was cremated. My grandmother was buried. He had his ashes scattered into the sea. My grandmother is in a churchyard, 6 feet under in a wicker coffin, a simple headstone with a line from Rupert Brooke for her epitaph. It's hard to imagine anything but peace for her. The last time I visited, I sat next to her tombstone and watched the leaves rustle in distant trees in the late summer twilight. The letter that accompanied the journal was 4 lines long. I hope this finds you well. Your father gave me your address to forward this diary along to you, as stipulated in your grandfather's will. The diary in question was an old-style cloth-bound A5 exercise book with Clairefontaine paper and summer 1981, written in my grandfather's haphazard hand on the front. There was nothing else. Nothing to tell me why he'd chosen to leave the diary to me, or what nuggets of information I'd find within. Even in the grave, my grandfather was a distant mystery. It sat on my kitchen table for a week, before I remembered to call my father to ask about it. A diary? Yes, there were a lot of them, but there's not really a whole lot we can do with them, as he wasn't successful or famous enough. He seemed to have no idea I'd been sent one, despite providing my address, nor what the significance of 1981 was. Why my grandfather believed I'd want to know what he was doing in the summer 8 years before my birth was anyone's guess. Sure, he'd been a wily fucker in life, but who would have thought the joke would carry on in death? It was another month before I actually read the thing. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, Netflix, you name it. are all pretty good at ruining any hopes of sitting down and reading for any sustained length of time. I got down to it one early summer evening, about a year after I'd been to the memorial and watched the ashes be cast into the sea. The blue irises in my garden were out, and I sat on the grass with the sound of planes travelling along the flight path overhead. My girlfriend at the time, Lizzie, was also in the garden. Summer dresses with leggings on underneath, headphones on, listening to a true crime podcast. I opened the journal, believing life couldn't get much sweeter than this, and began to read. June 3rd, 1981. Had a lunch with Marta today, and she told me everyone gets divorced sooner or later. The difference is some people actually do it. Others just do it in their hearts. I assume she's talking about me. June 4th, 1981. No word today. Stultifying dinner with the family. 15 years of stultification. June 9th, 1981. Another day with Marta. Made me feel the world's not as bad as I thought. Tired cliché about love is true after all. I stopped reading and looked over at Lizzie, who was now lying on her back looking up at the blue, blue sky. You grow up with certain views of your parents, your grandparents, and really your whole family. No one ever really gets their grandparents. History and generational gaps make sure of that. How the fuck is anyone who served on a British frigate in Malaya during the Second World War going to understand someone who spent most of their childhood playing video games, killing Nazi zombies, one hand on the controller, the other on an iPhone, texting your friends? How well do you know your grandparents? I asked Lizzie. She shook her headphones out and stared at me blankly. I said, how well do you know your grandparents? She sat up. As well as you know anyone. You think you know people well, and then they do something extraordinary you would never have seen coming. She smiled at me and put the headphones back in. I reread the 3 entries, unsure if I wanted to read any more about my grandfather's affair. Perhaps he'd sent me this diary in jest. Or maybe he'd intended me to receive a different one. I'm hardly a prude. I'd go as far as to say I don't think anyone can go a full marriage without one transgression, and I'm not sure fidelity is even something to strive for. The world's full of bourgeois prudes. Why not fuck around a little to set things straight? I just didn't want to read more into the details of an affair that frankly didn't interest me. I tossed the book aside and spent the rest of the afternoon staring at Lizzie, hoping she'd noticed the twinkle in my eye. She didn't. I brought up Marta with my father via a brief WhatsApp conversation the following day, if it could have been called a conversation. Know anyone called Marta? Grandpa mentions a Marta in his diary. Marta? The name rings a bell, but I can't help, I'm afraid. If ever there was a cryptic message, this was it. Did he mean she sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember why, or was he saying he knew who she was, but he wasn't willing to tell me? It was my mother who eventually broke the silence. My parents had long since divorced, my mother on the verge of another marriage, and my father with a long-term girlfriend. Marta, my mother told me, was the woman my grandfather ran off with when he left my grandmother. It was short-lived, apparently lasting only a summer, and was mostly suppressed by the family, who, in my mother's words, were a bunch of half-American Puritans who believed life was about religious fervour and self-flagellation. No points for guessing which summer. It explained a lot. Perhaps not everything, but it certainly explained my grandmother's drinking, and why they weren't buried next to each other. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. I was ashamed. I was ashamed that the message peddled by my family was that my grandfather had spent long years tolerating my grandmother, eventually nursing her through alcoholism and dementia, when in fact it had been my grandmother putting up with him. For a week after I found out, I had no desire to read any more of the diary. My grandfather was a narcissistic fucker playing a narcissistic joke that I wanted no part in. I was tempted to burn the thing. And if it wasn't for a conversation I'd had with Lizzie, I probably would have. We were lying in bed at her flat in Peckham, not post-coitus, but post-sleep. In less than 3 months we'd stopped being post-coitus, and I already preferred nights in and clothes on. I'd always assumed I'd failed at the hypermasculinity test for not wanting to fornicate every 5 minutes and show off the amazing lovemaking skills I'd learnt in GQ. But it was more to do with my passing feelings for people. First night I loved them, second I liked them, third, I don't know what. So why do you think he sent you the diary? That's the $1,000,000 question. But you haven't read all of it anyway, so you'll never know why he sent it to you. Sage words. There's no need to be sarky. I'm just trying to help you in your voyage of discovery that's seemingly such a challenge for you. I'm not interested in my grandfather's love life. Would you be? Not in the details, but I'd want to know my grandparents enjoyed themselves, that they were human, at least. He treated my grandmother appallingly. I'd be desecrating her memory by reading it. How melodramatic. The fact is, if you don't read it, you'll never know why he sent it to you. She was right. She was right about most things. I resolved to read the rest of the thing at the next opportunity. That took a while, and it wasn't until a rainy Sunday in August that I got round to it. It was an experience I'd soon want to forget. I should have abandoned family life years ago. The children and Sarah make me feel sick. Mealtimes are like going down to the 8th circle. Writing in this diary has to be done in secret. All I think about at home and at work is Marta. June 16th, 1981. Love. A lot of people never know how it feels. Family life certainly has no love in it. It's been 5 days since I last saw her. These irregular meetings must become more regular. Sarah is watching me right now. She repulses me. I know she suspects something. She's always been suspicious. How much longer must I suffer in this house? All that is keeping me sane is the knowledge that I will have her in my arms tomorrow. June 17th, 1981. An hour feels like 5 minutes with her. Our day ended before it had even got going. And now, after staring at Marta's eyes for 9 hours, I'm staring at my youngest watching TV. What kind of a life is this? We talked about running away together today. Marta told me she didn't mind where we went. She can work anywhere, being freelance. She said she wanted to go somewhere hot. I dreamed of whisking her away to somewhere in Texas, where we know no one, and we can live anonymous happy lives, loving each other and thinking of nothing but our undying love. It sounded like a love-struck teenager. It was hard to imagine the somewhat cold, mostly charming man that had been my grandfather as this gushing, love-struck wannabe Romeo. The entries carried on in this way for the rest of June. The descriptions of domestic life became more offensive. My grandmother made his skin crawl with her fake touches. I wonder how he made her feel. Worse, no doubt. The house he was describing was the same one they'd lived in for years, and I'd visited it many times as a child. It was standard American fare. White picket fence, an immaculately kept garden, a basement, kitchen, 5 bedrooms, snug room for the kids. Usual deal. My earliest memory of visiting it was of spending hours with my brother sliding down the laundry chute before being caught and reprimanded by my grandmother, Sarah in the diaries. It was soulless in the way only American houses can be. Hollowed out by a failed marriage. July began like this. July the 2nd, 1981. Tomorrow we're doing it. We've been discussing it all month, but I didn't want to write anything in here for fear Sarah would read it and ruin our plans. But now I don't care. It's decided. I don't care what Sarah finds out, because there's nothing that can stop our plans now. At 7 a.m. I'll leave for work, but just go and collect Marta by the courthouse instead. We'll travel south. South to freedom and happiness, and I'll never have to see this hellish family that I spawned again. Tonight, after the long years of torture, I'm finally going to be free. After that melodramatic climax, there were no entries for a week. I imagined him and Marta meeting secretly, both wearing dark glasses, both trying to make the sad pre-teen adventure that bit more exciting than it actually was. Then just hours of driving to this imagined destination, this place of freedom, a dreary American landscape ruining their true romance. July the 9th, 1981. We're here. Marta had her doubts, but we made it. We spent the last 2 days in a motel, just staying in bed and being happy to be in each other's arms. This is what heaven is. In the interest of brevity, I'll elide the next 2 weeks. There are only 5 entries, and they take the same boring tone as the previous entry. July 23rd, 1981. Fantasy is always better than reality. After 2 weeks of near bliss, Marta told me last night she's having doubts. Doubts about what? Doubts about breaking up a marriage and a family. I told her it was too late. The family, whatever family there was, is already broken. She said it could be fixed, that Sarah would forgive me and everything could go back to normal. The kids would not even remember. Back at the motel, the shock having subsided somewhat, I lost my temper and shouted at her for the first time. She told me she understood my anger, tried to calm me down with an embrace. So I had no choice but to slap her away. She fell on the bed and I hit her again and again and again. Something terrible took hold of me. and I could only stop when I saw Marta's blood on the white sheets. She was weeping, but I comforted her, and then we made love. I don't know what kind of person I am, but then I don't know what kind of person Marta is. A breeze was coming through the open window, and I had to get up and close it. Not that I particularly wanted to read any more. Aside from the domestic abuse, there was something about the way the entry was written that shocked me. The casual way he wrote of anger, the nonchalance, the rationalised explanation for his violence. I wanted to say this wasn't a man I knew, but I recognised my grandfather through and through. The cold, often emotionless scientist. The uninterested way he used to speak to me and other grandchildren. As if we were his tie to the world, and without us he'd be out there, free and beating women to his heart's content. In spite of the way Marta had apparently forgiven him, and let him fuck her afterwards, she'd actually started to resent him. She must have. Who could love a man who treated her like that? I pulled my phone out and searched Marta, Carolina, 1981. There were too many results to make sense of, so I searched for my grandfather's name instead. The first result was a news article about a domestic disturbance in a motel. I was amazed I'd never seen this before, but how often do you Google your grandparents? Residents had heard raised voices and informed management who had called the police. The woman, Marta, was described as distraught and visibly shaken, while the man, my grandfather, was calm and courteous despite the accusations from other motel guests. The article didn't say what the accusations were, and if there were follow-up articles, they hadn't been digitised. I knew what he'd been accused of, though. Diary didn't make it explicit, but my bet was that the love-making they'd done after the abuse was pretty one-sided. My grandfather knew better than to admit to rape in his diary. The remaining entries made no mention of the incident. I have no idea when exactly my grandfather returned to his family, but it was clearly after the summer of 1981. Lizzie agreed with me. The entry was nothing less than the description of a rape. I mean, it's pretty obvious what happened after the argument. The love-making was not love-making at all. I just don't understand why he sent me this. Beats me. Maybe he thought because you're a lawyer you'd work to exonerate him. Exonerate him? He wasn't tried or even charged. I'm assuming Marta didn't say anything. More than likely. So maybe he wants you to seek justice. Justice for who? I looked across at her. She was sitting, back bolstered against the many pillows on the bed, still half reading the diary. She smiled at me and I tried not to picture my grandfather hitting Marta until she was weak and then stripping her clothes off and raping her, justifying it to himself all the while in his cold and rational and scientific mind. And he had been all those things. What scientists aren't? Trying to reason his way out of the horrendous actions his rationalism had led him to. Justice, I said to Lizzie. Exactly. How am I going to deliver that? I don't know. You're the lawyer. Use your imagination. Justice for Marta? Well done, Sherlock. I wondered how I could bring Marta justice and what such justice would even look like. What justice could be brought to rape victims? How much punishment for the offender would make the victim feel healed? I suppose I could find Marta. That would be a start, if she's still alive, of course. I spent the following week on the internet looking for Marta. I got nowhere. There must have been 100,000 martyrs in the US alone, and thousands over the age of 80. The article I'd found previously was the only one about the motel incident, and neither of the involved parties had been named. The whole thing was a black box, and the only option was to ask my reluctant family. I wondered if they knew about the rape. I assumed, and hoped, not. I spoke with my father first, and got a stock response. He knew nothing about Martha, other than that she'd had an affair with his father. He didn't know why I was so interested, and didn't want to talk about his dead father's infidelities anymore. Suppressed memories? It seemed likely. It was my uncle who told me eventually. He responded to my email with a 2-sentence reply. Marta Balsals, I'm sure you can understand why I don't want to talk about it. Actually, I didn't, but I didn't say that. I didn't understand any of it. Maybe they all knew and just kept the memories suppressed. Their reaction to the affair was too clandestine. My grandparents were dead. If they weren't going to talk now, when would they talk? I spent an afternoon Googling Marta Balsals. It threw out a lot of meaningless results. I made a list of 3 martyrs I'd try and contact, all around the right age, all living in the US, all potential victims of my grandfather's misguided lust. I sent them all a rote Facebook message and waited for their responses. Of course it took a while. They were all in their mid-80s and it was miracle enough that they even had Facebook. I expected no miracles as far as their response time went. After 2 weeks, I began to think that they wouldn't respond at all, and that I got the wrong martyr. The right martyr was not on Facebook or was already dead. The histrionics were preemptive. I got a response about a week later. My grandmother is happy to talk to you. If you call 012-555-111 at 8 p.m. Midwestern time, she'll be expecting your call. It was not the response I was expecting, and it certainly wasn't the time I was expecting. A phone call at 2 a.m. to discuss a potential rape was not the romantic end I had in mind. Still, it was better than no resolution at all, and me forever wondering. I spent the 4 days until Sunday in a state of intense anxiety. What other revelations was I going to find out about my family? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and maybe I was not too dissimilar from my grandfather. Maybe all I needed was a trigger too. I should say before we begin that it's been a very long time, and I'm old and my memory really isn't what it used to be. I know everyone says that, but it's true. I apologise in advance for any questions I can't answer. That's fine, I said, pressing my recorder. Why don't you tell me what you do remember? I remember I loved your grandfather. I think that's worth something. We had a very intense affair, and I think you only meet 1 or 2 people in life who you're great loves, and if you're lucky, you end up with them. If you're like most people, you end up with someone you kinda love, but they're not your great love. But it doesn't mean you can't be happy. It just means you're never going to know what true bliss is. Your grandfather had a lot of faults, but he was my great love. I felt terrible that I had a hand in taking him away from his family, but some things are more powerful than guilt. So we ran away together, which, as I'm sure you know, was short-lived. He still saw me when we got back to Maine, and we might have had an affair for years. I could have been his mistress forever, but that's not the life I wanted at the time. So I moved to the Midwest, took a teaching job that was a major step down on the career ladder, and decided to live a quiet life. That's the best kind of life, I can assure you. Don't try and change the world. Just live in it and appreciate its beauty. I understand why people become ambitious. Your grandfather was ambitious. He used to tell me about his grand plans to change the world by helping others in whatever way he could, but he never did change the world. People rarely do. I've always thought a beggar who saves a dog's life does as much good for the world as the billionaire who cures malaria. That's just my opinion, though. There was a silence, and I would have thought the line had gone dead if it wasn't for her cracked breathing at the other end. I knew what I had to ask, what I wanted to ask. So why did you and my grandfather decide to return to Maine? Good question. I suppose life on the road and in the South was not quite what we'd both imagined it would be. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think your grandfather didn't love me the way he thought he did. I think it was a childish love that didn't develop into real love. For him it was either a ceaseless love of the kind they push on the big screen or nothing at all. Being on the road brought it home for him and made him see that the love that requires some effort was not for him. So we decided to return to Maine. It broke my heart, but if you love something, you have to set it free. And it continued a while, but I knew it was dead as soon as we returned. Mine cracked a few times and I wasn't sure I could bring myself to ask the question I had on my lips, but I knew for the sake of a very millennial kind of closure I had to say something. I read about an incident in a motel. I thought it was you and my grandfather. He didn't hurt you in some way, did he? Not physically, he'd never do that. He wasn't that kind of man. But he hurt my heart, that's for sure. And that was the end of our call. She apologised and said she hoped to have been useful. I sat for a while, looking at the magnolia outside my windows, Grandpa's diary on the table beside me, my phone next to it. I texted Lizzie, and she texted back. I closed my eyes and waited for her to come round.
Thank you for listening. Once again, if you'd like to have your work featured on the show, please send it to editor@otherpeoplesflowers.com. Please remember, we only accept work that has been rejected elsewhere.